the hushing of the room when somebody approaches the microphone with a little bit of authority. No authority, but purpose, at least. Wel, croeso cynnes I chi I gyd yma i'r Llyfrgell Genedlaethol ar drwm ar gyfer ddarlith heno. A very warm welcome to you all to the National Library, to the drum, and to everyone joining us online as well. Of course, this evening's lecture is going to discuss the creation and reception of the Great Bible of 1539, the first authorised edition of the Bible in English. The brainchild of committed reformer Thomas Cromwell, of course, and supported by King Henry VIII, the Great Bible is often seen as a monument of reform and authority. Now, the lecture ties in with a fascinating exhibition upstairs in the Hengwrt Gallery entitled Reunited, which places side by side the great Bibles of Cromwell and Henry VIII for the first time in 500 years. The exhibition accompanying the two great Bibles is also a bit of a treat. It charts the seismic institutional change from Catholicism to Protestantism in England and Wales, and shows how this played out with the aid of the revolutionary technology of the printing press. Well worth a visit if you haven't been, and a repeat visit if you have. But on to the lecture tonight and our speaker. Professor Eyal Poleg is Professor of Material History at Queen Mary University of London. He is a principal investigator of the research project Hidden in Plain Sight, Historical and Scientific Analysis of Pre-Modern Sacred Books, which is funded by the AHRC. It's a groundbreaking interdisciplinary project, and we feel very fortunate at the library to be able to participate. A historian of objects and faith, Professor Poleg's work explores the ways objects can inform us about the history of medieval and early modern religion. His work has featured in The Times, on CBS and BBC Radio 4, and now he's made it at the National Library of Wales. Please welcome Professor Eyal Poleg.
Thank you very much, Rodri. And thank you very much for coming and for hosting me in the library. It's an amazing opportunity to be here and also to see the exhibition. And I've been working on these Bibles for quite a long time, about 6 or 7 years. But still, I was very emotional seeing them together in the Treasures Room today. It is a unique opportunity. And it is really the first time in 500 years that they are coming together. Two very important copies of the Great Bible. And I want to thank the library and to thank Rodri and Jamie and Timothy, Nia and Daniel for helping with arranging the exhibition and arranging these talks. What I'm going to do today is discuss the Great Bible and its historical place. And a lot of it relies on my work in the material history of the Bible, England, 1200 to 1553, which is for sale outside, but this is the only pitch I'm going to do. And tomorrow, the lecture will look actually at the scientific analysis of the two copies, and that's why tomorrow's paper will not be screened, because it still is research in progress, and more questions and answers, but a lot of new discoveries using new technologies to analyze these pages. The Great Bible is a very important book. It is the monument of English reform, and it has been seen as such for a long time. It tried to revolutionize the landscape of sacred books in England. Thomas Cromwell, the Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote a prologue to the Great Bible, in which he made it very explicit that all people are to read the Bible especially the lower classes. He mentioned the publicans and the fishermen and the shepherds. And he admonished readers for not giving the time, because of lack of time or leisure, to read the Bible, and advised them to consult the Bible, even though, and I quote, "thy wife provoke thee to anger, thy child give thee occasion to take sorrow and pensiveness." This misogynist trope will repeat again in 1543. You'll see it later on. So he was really aiming at spreading the Bible to everyone, enabling for the first time Bible reading by the lower classes. And this was reflected in the legislation. Thomas Cromwell's injunctions in 1536 stated explicitly that every parson or proprietary of any parish church within the realm shall, on this side of the feast of St. Peter ad Vincula next coming, so the 1st of August 1536, provide a book of the whole Bible, both in Latin and also in English. In 1538, when the injunctions was repeated, the Latin disappeared. And this was repeated in decrees in the Diocese of Worcester, Lichfield, Coventry, York, Salisbury, Exeter, and Hereford. So, in theory, this book revolutionized the landscape of sacred books, of parishes, and of Bible reading in early modern England. And if you look at the appearance of this book, and here again, going to the exhibition will help, you'll see why it's called the Great Bible. It is a big book. It's the kind of book that you lift from your knees, so to speak. And you can see it here in these two presentation copies. The reason it was an impressive book was intentional. Cromwell and Cranmer, the first minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury, were ardent reformers. They wanted, as you can see from Cranmer's prologue, to spread the word. Henry, on the other side, was much more hesitant. He was not a firm believer in the Reformed cause. He wanted some gains, which he got with the break from Rome. He wanted the ability to remarry. He wanted the ability to control 25% of the land in England. But he was not an ardent reformer. In his eyes, empowering the laity was a more complicated business. And Cromwell and Cranmer did their uttermost to convince Henry. Now they knew that Henry liked beautiful things. So they said, we'll create a Bible that is worthy of royal patronage. And the first thing they decided to do immediately afterwards, realizing we're not going to do it in England. Because England, when you think about printing, was a backwater. Printing in England staggered behind the continent. A good example of that is the only Bible printed in England beforehand, which almost no one has worked on that, still I think is a fascinating book. This is the Bible that was printed in 1535 in England by the royal printer Thomas Berthollet. And it is an amazingly underwhelming book. Whilst on the continent, they experimented with size, with color printing, with typography. This is what the best English printer at the time could achieve. It's a book in quarto, recycling a generic title page, promising a second volume. This is Sacred Bible, still in Latin, first volume. And the preface says, we're just waiting, we'll provide a second volume. They never provide a second volume, nor, if you look at the way it was constructed, nor they actually intended to. They couldn't. This is the state of English printing at the time. And Cromwell and Cranmer are aware of that. This is the best that could be produced in England. Now, incidentally, we'll go back to this Bible later on, because working on this Bible, this is a copy in Lambeth Palace, I noticed something quite interesting. This is the verso of the title page, and it looks like a blank page. but you see a hole there at the top. And I became interested in that, and using a light sheet, I realized a lot of things were written and then pasted over with a piece of paper. And using some very simple photography, but very smart algorithm. So the algorithm was made by Graham Davis, as a professor at the School of Dentistry at Queen Mary, and Steph Ills from then Lambeth Palace was helping with photography. We were able to clear it completely. And what we found here is actually something from the Great Bible, which we'll go back to later on. So in the okayish 16th century hand, you can see on the first Sunday in Lent, and then it gives you the biblical reading. So this is the table of lections of biblical readings for the liturgical year, copied from the Great Bible. And we'll go back to this later on to figure out what he was doing there. But this was the state of English printing. Worse than that, there was no paper mill in England. The price of paper was more than half of the price of a book. And if you wanted a big book, you needed lots of paper, good quality paper, which wasn't available in England. And remind you, there was literally not a press big enough in England to print this Bible. So they went to one of the centers of printing, to Paris. To the printing press of François Regnault, who was a quite famous Parisian printer at the time, quite old as well. And he's been printing for the English market for about 30 years by then. So he's well acquainted with the English market. And a team reallocates to Paris to oversee the production of the Bible. And the three main actors in this team were people well known from previous Bibles. Miles Coverdale, whose 1535 Bible is the first full Bible in English, printed of course on the continent, together with Richard Grafton and Edward Whitchurch, who are the stationers responsible for printing of the Matthew's Bible in 1537. So Coverdale was doing the translation and the editing, whereas Whitchurch and Grafton were doing actually the practicalities of printing with Regnault. The useful thing for us is because they are in Paris and Cromwell, who's backing and supporting this project, is in England, we have a bit of the correspondence. Because usually we know very little about the practicalities of printing at the period, because it's rarely documented, and if it's documented, it's on scraps of paper that wouldn't survive. Whereas here, because the production team is split between Paris and London, we have a bit of correspondence. We can see what's happening. We have letters sent to Cromwell the 23rd of June, 1538. They ask for additional funds, as always. But they know how to speak to Cromwell, they praise the materiality, the paper, the best sort in France. So they know how to sell their book, and also say the contents. It has, with annotations, as shall doubtless elucidate and clear the same. But things are not going very well in Paris. The letter from the 13th of December, 1538, Coverdale is saying, if these men proceed in their cruelness against us, because he's noticing the French authorities are having problems with the printing of the Bible, which actually is not religiously, even though France is Catholic at the time, but it's political. And a week later, the 17th of December, 1538, the French authorities clamp down on production, bring the Inquisition, and confiscate the sheets that are printed. Interestingly, they allow Grafton and Whitchurch to take the presses, the type, and a lot of the woodcuts and some of the paper to England to continue printing, which created a huge mess for scholars of the Bible, because a lot of the Bibles produced ever since, the great Bibles, combine elements from the Parisian print and the London print, which is very difficult to differentiate between the two, but it revolutionized English printing because it brought new technology to London in a way that didn't exist before. Now, for us, what is interesting is to see that Coverdale mentions the thing about this wicked man almost as an aside. His main interests in the letters to Cromwell is something different. Now, this is an interesting experiment because we don't have Cromwell's letters. When Cromwell was arrested, it seems that his aides eradicated his outbox, the folder of copies of letter he actually sent, because these were more dangerous. But they left the inbox. So we have the letters sent to him. And it's interesting to see from the tone of the letters to second guess what his replies would have been. Because, as I said, in the 23rd of June 1538, they talk about annotations. With such annotations shall doubtless elucidate and clear the same. It looks like Cromwell didn't like that. He had a problem with the annotations, because the next letter sent to him, the 9th of August 1538, it says that there are manicules, pointing fingers, you can see them here, that signifies that upon the same, in the later end of the book, there is some notable annotation, which we have written without any private opinion, only after the best interpretation of the Hebrews, for the more clearliness of the text. So these manicules are actually a medieval device, pointing hands, that the printers put in as sort of footnotes and say, we have some annotations we would want to add at the end to explain the text better. But you can see from the two letters already that they start apologizing for the annotations. Obviously, Cromwell has a problem with these. And the next letter, the one from December in which Coverdale mentioned as an aside that the evil men are about to confiscate our presses, is concerned mostly with the annotations. This is Coverdale. I humbly beseech your lordship that by my lord elect of Hereford I may know of your pleasure concerning the annotations of this Bible, whether I shall proceed therein or no. Pity it were that the dark places of that text, upon the which I have always set a hand, and he printed the manicule, handwritten the manicule, should so pass undeclared. As for any private opinion or contentious words, as I will utterly avoid of all such, so will I offer the annotations first to my said Lord of Hereford, to the intent that he shall so examine the same, afore they be put in print, if it be your lordship's good pleasure that I shall do so. So Coverdale really tries to explain to Cromwell that these annotations are really important, but is hitting a brick wall. Because when the Bible is published in 1539, you have the manicules that you've just seen, but you don't have anything else. And this is being explained in the prologue. We have also, as you may see, added many hands, both in the margins of these volumes and also in the text, upon the which we propose to have made in the end of the Bible, in a table by themselves, certain godly annotations. But so for much as yet has not been sufficient time ministered to the king's most honourable counsel for the oversight and correction of the said annotation, we will therefore omit them, till their most convenient leisure. Doing now no more but beseech the most gentle reader that when you comest at such a place where the handle stand, or in any other where in the Bible, and you cannot attain to the meaning and true knowledge of the sentence, then do not rashly presume to make any private interpretation thereof. but submit thyself to the judgment of those that are godly learned in Christ Jesus. Now, previous scholars, Evelyn Tribe and William Sherman, have seen that as an isolated moment in which biblical segments were more or less church properties. But what we can see here is a bigger process and a real problem with the annotations. Cromwell is being practical, and he realizes that the annotations would be difficult to support because there is a lot of opposition that he's encountering. And whereas him and Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, are trying to move forward, there's a lot of conservative factions in court and in church preventing them from doing so. And the annotations a lot of times are in the eye of the storm of these discussions. And one of the best examples of that will happen a few years later in the Geneva Bible, a Bible produced in 1560 during Elizabeth's reign, whose annotations incurred the wrath of the English court to the extent leading to King James's version in 1611. King James specifically negated the annotations of the Geneva Bible, because these annotations will empower lay readership, will drop the middleman. So what happened here, you have the manicules, no explanation, no annotations, no commentary, just a preface saying, we're just waiting for the Privy Council to do that. This repeats again in the second edition, and then next editions, the manicules are dropped. And that's it. The manicule disappeared as a sign that there's a mistrust in lay readership, or more than that, informed lay readership. This mistrust is evident actually when you look at the materiality of these Bibles. It's something that is very basic. The Bible is called the Great Bible for a reason. These are very big books. But, surprisingly, they have almost no margins. The Bible is printed almost to the edge of the page. This is breaking with medieval customs. Medieval Bibles, especially the large one, would be something like that. This is a glossa ordinaria. The idea is you can annotate your Bibles. But again, this will empower readers. And this is something that Cromwell is realizing Henry would not approve of. So that is gone. What you do have in the Bible, in all editions of the Great Bible, there are 7 editions printed in short succession by Witchett and Grafton. You have liturgical annotations. This is the table of lessons, to remind you, that we've seen here in the Lambeth Bible as well. And it supports the reading of the Bible in the liturgical year. But, there is a huge but here. The Bible doesn't really make sense within English liturgy of the time. As the Bible is being printed, Thomas Cromwell is redrafting a new understanding of English liturgy. He's creating a template for a revolutionary liturgy in England, church worship, in which the Bible would be read throughout the year in a way that hasn't been done by in any country up until then. It's really a revolutionary liturgy. But Cranmer, who is very astute, realizing this is not the right time. So he shelved his draft liturgy. Only with the book of... Sorry? Sorry. Yeah. Only with the Book of Common Prayer, after the death of Henry, he's taking back his liturgy. But what that means is that the Bible, the Great Bible, was meant for this kind of liturgy, which would appear about a decade later. When the Bible is being published, and each parish church is forced to buy one, the liturgy is mostly medieval. It doesn't make sense. You won't use most of the Bible within the liturgy of the church. There's a bigger problem here. We used to think about a parish Bible, right? If I tell you what is a parish Bible, you have an image of your mind usually, of this kind of big book sits on a lectern in churches. And even historians of the Bible think about that as a custom that goes back to the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, this is untrue. And I think I've done enough legwork surveying all excellent church warden accounts, bishop's visitation, and church records I wouldn't say all, but the majority of them for sure, to say with certainty that in the Middle Ages, parish churches, by and large, did not have a Bible. They had liturgical books. They would have a lectionary, which is a book that has the biblical readings for specific liturgical occasions, but not a full Bible. They don't need it for the liturgy. It's a very big book, quite expensive. There's no reason for them to have one, and there's not a single law, church law, that requires them to have one. And the legislation that we've seen that Cromwell is imposing in 1536, 1538, mandating each parish church to buy a Bible, is revolutionary. It's the first time that parish churches are required to have a Bible. And this really transformed the landscape of sacred books in England. But it's a new thing. They're not used to having a Bible. They're being forced to buy one. And it's not cheap. So it's 10 shilling for unbound, 12 shilling for bound, but this is without portage. So if you live in a church that is away from the production centres, the price could go up to something like 30 shillings, which should be split between the parishioners and the curate. So it's an expensive book they are forced to buy. But that book doesn't make sense with the liturgy. It also doesn't make sense with church architecture. Where would you put it? In the church, where would you put your new Bible that you're forced to buy? Originally choir, but very quickly the legislation moved it to the nave, because, say, the parishioners should be able to look at that. So this is already in Salisbury, the legislation of Bishop Nicholas Shaxton decreed that the Bible was to be chained to a desk, which is a common practice in cathedrals and monasteries as well, with similar devices extant in York. But without Cranmer's new liturgy, there's a sort of a vacuum that the worship in churches was ill-suited for that Bible. And it didn't accord for it the first decade with the liturgy or its performance. Now, at the time, church architecture, church furniture are still medieval. So there is a rood screen separating the priest from the congregation. Now, on which side of the rood screen is the new Bible? It's on the parishioner's side. And that's a huge problem. Because there's an extremely expensive book that parishioners are forced to buy that is on the wrong side of the screen. for liturgical performance. What do you do with it? This actually explains a lot of the criticisms of reformers at the time. Because, for example, there's an anonymous reform tract of 1546 that says many of this wicked generation, as well priests as others, faithful adherents, would pluck the Bible out of the core, either else into some pew where poor men does not presume to come. So they would pluck the Bible from the parishioner's side. But of course, if they want to use it in the liturgy, they have no option of doing it but to do that, because they cannot read the Bible from that side of the church. Another treatise from the time discussed the fact that Henry VIII, so this is 1542, Thomas Beacon, News Out of Heaven, and he praises Henry for supporting the vernacular Bible, but then he says, and we start here at the bottom of the left side, but how many read it? Verily, a man may come into some churches and see the Bible so enclosed and wrapped about with dust, even as the pulpit, in like manner as both with dust and cobwebs, that with his finger he may write upon the Bible this epitaph, Ecce nunc in pulvere dormio, behold, now I sleep in dust, which is from the book of Job. Again, the book doesn't make sense liturgically. It's in a wrong place at the wrong time. Would you leave it to be filled with cobwebs? Would you pluck it and put it on a pew? You need the furniture of Edward VI or Elizabeth to make better sense of that. But this is not the worst outcome. Because, of course, it's on the parishioner's side of the church. Now, they paid for that Bible. It's in a language they can actually speak. So they have the audacity to read the Bible. And that creates the real problem. Because what happens then is we start having legislation against that. So Edmund Bonner, Bishop of London, gets 6 Bibles and put them in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. But in 1541, he had Grafton and Whitchurch print this sheet that this encourages lay reading, but instilling greater obedience to the monarch, and says explicitly, "Nor reading thereof be used aloud and with noise in the time of any divine service or sermon, or that in the same there be used any disputations, contentions, or any other misdemeanors." So you can see the problem that is happening here. That the Bible is chained to a desk in a parishioner section of the church, and they start reading it. Maybe during service. And maybe they try to, what they would call at the time, reason, to make arguments. And that is a real big problem for Henry and his ministers. Because that's the real threat. The empowerment of lay reading is something that Henry is very hesitant about. And in many ways, the experiment of Cromwell and Cranmer fails because of that. Because they try to convince Henry with an ideal scenario of a beautiful book praising the monarch being put in the laity hand, who will appreciate their biblical monarch as a result. But it doesn't work because they start reading the Bible on their own. And that doesn't go well. And what happens as a result is Royal Proclamation, 1541. The parishioners are to obey their sovereign lord and high powers without murmur or grudging. The purpose of art rehearse humbly, meekly, reverently, and obediently, and not that any of them should read the said Bible with loud and high voices, in time of the celebration of the Holy Mass and other divine services used in the church, nor that any his lay subject reading the same should presume to take upon them any common disputation, arguments, or exposition of the mystery therein contained. So, they can read quietly, but not think about it too much, not talk about it, and a bit like Cromwell's prologue, have the priest tell them what to think. Obviously, that doesn't work. Because in 1543, the Act of the Advancement of True Religion simply curbed unrestricted access to Scripture. Henry cut that. He forbade private and public reading by women of the lower classes, going back to Cromwell misogynist trope, as well as artificers, apprentices, journeymen, yeomen, and the lower classes. So the Bible, the great Bible experiment failed. Henry restricted, and not just not allowing disputation, but not allowing any reading of the lower classes. Most likely this was more on paper than in practice, because the Bibles were not retracted from the churches. They still existed in churches, but people who paid for them were not allowed to read them. And we know only of one single prosecution based on that act, and that is a very complicated prosecution as well. And looking at it through the prism of the 1543 legislation, the title page of the Great Bible suddenly gets a stronger meaning. Because what you see here, and this I'm going to talk about it more tomorrow, is Henry distributing Bibles assisted by Cranmer on Henry's right and Cromwell on his left, and the Bible trickles down, reaching the parish on the lower register. But as noted by Margaret Aston, the parishioners in the lower register don't have any physical Bibles. They just listen to the word of God from the pulpit. So this became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what I hope to do tomorrow is concentrate a lot on these title pages of the Great Bible and showing how new scientific analysis can assist us in uncovering the layers of the book and discovering hesitations, changes, transformations that took place as the Bible was being printed in Paris and London, and giving some more insight primarily into Cromwell's mindset. A lot of it would be, again, about lay reading of the Bible. But what I would want to finish with is the fact that the Great Bible was an extremely influential book. It transformed the landscape of sacred books in England. It was the first true parish Bible, something that really changed the way the Bible was approached for centuries. Moving the presses from Paris to London, likewise changed English printing. It gave two of the most influential stationers technologies that hitherto did not exist in England, and the ability to create new books. And again, if you go to the exhibition upstairs, you'll see one missal that was printed by Renoir in Paris, but also a book that was printed by Whitchurch in London, later on, the first book printed in Welsh. The text of the Great Bible was also very influential, especially the Psalms, because the Psalms of the Great Bible were the same psalms of the Book of Common Prayer. And that's how people remember the psalms. So when there are new and actually superior translations of the psalms in the Geneva Bible or the King James Bible, a lot of time will be accompanied by the inferior translation from the Book of Common Prayer, from the Great Bible, because this is how people will think about the psalms at that stage. So it was an extremely influential book. But I hope you would agree with me that at its time, when it was produced, incompatible with the liturgy or the architecture or the politics, it was a useless book. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure you agree with me. That was a fascinating lecture. Wonderful lecture, Professor Poleg. Thank you very much. It's a real treat. I think our time is at an end for tonight, but I'm sure this has whet your appetite to come back tomorrow for the follow-up lecture with Professor Poleg, who's going to be sharing a little more about the research aspects of the work that he and the Hidden in Plain Sight team have been working on. So we're looking forward to that very much. I just want to say a very quick thank you to my colleagues for organising this event as well, and to the wonderful partnership we've had with St John's College, Cambridge, which has enabled us to borrow the wonderful Great Bible as part of the exhibition. And yeah, you can still go along and see that exhibition upstairs until November, so it's here, plenty of opportunity to do that. And well, while the pricing might have been dynamic for the Great Bible, the prices for Professor Poleg's volume are completely set and consistent as a recommended retail purchase price, I think, and the copies are available outside after the lecture. So just thank you all very much to you here for joining us, and to everyone at home. And if you could just join me once again to thank Professor Eyal Poleg. Diolch yn fawr iawn am y siarad.